Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound of water. Not the gentle lapping of a lake on a quiet evening, but something bigger, something older. The deep, rhythmic heave of the open sea at night, waves lifting and dropping a vessel so large it groans under its own weight. The wood beneath you flexes, the rigging hisses, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, there is nothing but ocean, black and vast and indifferent to whether you survive the crossing. Welcome. If you are listening to this right now, wherever in the world you happen to be, I want you to know that you are in very good company. Leave a comment and tell me where you are, what time it is, and whether the sea outside your window is calm or wild tonight. I genuinely love seeing where this community gathers. And if this kind of quiet, immersive journey through history is the kind of thing that helps you unwind, consider subscribing so you never miss another voyage. Now, dim the lights, let your breathing slow, because tonight we are going to sea with the Vikings. Not the Hollywood version, not the horned helmets and screaming warriors of popular imagination. We are going to the real thing. The longship at night, somewhere in the North Atlantic in the year 900. The sail furled, the oars shipped, and a crew of exhausted men trying to sleep on an open deck in the middle of the ocean. And here is the honest truth that will reshape how you think about these legendary people. What they endured every night at sea was one of the most physically demanding sleeping conditions any human being has ever faced. No shelter, no warmth, no privacy. Just the ocean, the wind, and whatever you could improvise between sunset and dawn. You probably wouldn't survive a single night of it, at least not without learning a few tricks. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what happens here. And now, let the world outside soften and quiet, because the longship is waiting. You step down onto the deck of a Viking longship for the first time, and your immediate instinct is to look for walls. There are none. The ship is open from stem to stern, a long, shallow vessel built for speed rather than comfort. Its sides barely rising above the waterline, the sky directly overhead, and the ocean visible on every side through the gaps between the oar ports. The ship is approximately 20 meters long and perhaps 4.5 meters wide at its widest point. On this vessel, somewhere between 20 and 40 men must sleep, eat, row, fight, and in some cases die. The mathematics of the space are unforgiving. The ship smells of pine resin and salt water, and the particular acrid smell of wet wool that you will come to know intimately over the weeks ahead. The deck planks are slick with spray. Your boots find uncertain purchase on the wet wood, and you realize within the first hour that keeping your balance on a vessel that moves constantly in 3 dimensions simultaneously is itself an exhausting skill that your body has not yet learned. This is where you will sleep tonight. This is where the Vikings slept on their voyages of raid and trade and exploration that took them from Scandinavia to Newfoundland, from Greenland to Constantinople, from the rivers of Russia to the coast of North Africa. Not in cabins, not under cover. Out here, on this deck, in whatever the sky decided to deliver. You want to know how they survived it. So do we. Let us find out together. The first thing you need to understand is that a Viking longship was not designed with sleep in mind. It was designed to be fast. Archaeologists who have studied surviving vessels, most notably the famous Gokstad ship discovered in a burial mound in Norway in 1880, have marveled at the extraordinary engineering. The hull was clinker-built, overlapping planks of oak riveted together with iron, and the whole construction was deliberately flexible rather than rigid. It moved with the sea rather than fighting it, bending and flexing under stress, which made it extraordinarily seaworthy in conditions that would destroy a stiffer vessel. But that same flexibility, that constant subtle movement of the planks beneath you, meant that sleeping on the deck was like trying to sleep on a living thing. The ship breathed. It shifted. Every wave communicated itself up through the wood and into your body, and your sleeping mind had to constantly adjust, tense and release, in rhythm with the sea's demands. Here is a quirky detail that most accounts of Viking seafaring never mention. The men who rowed these ships did not have fixed benches. They sat on their own sea chests, their personal storage boxes that they brought aboard with them, and which served simultaneously as their seat during rowing, their storage container for gear and possessions, and at night, their bed. The sea chest was the one piece of furniture a Viking sailor possessed on a voyage. Everything else was improvised from what the ship and the sea and the sky provided. So picture yourself now sitting on your chest, your back aching from a day of rowing, your hands blistered and raw, and the sun finally sinking below the horizon to the west. The question is not simply where to sleep, but how? And the answer, worked out by generations of seafarers, is a study in pragmatic ingenuity. The primary defense against the cold at sea was something that took modern researchers some time to properly appreciate. It was the sleeping bag. Not the modern zipped nylon cocoon, but something that served exactly the same function, and that Viking sailors called a hudfat, which translates roughly as a hide container or hide sleeping sack. These were large sacks made from the hide of animals, usually ox or seal skin, sometimes treated with fat to make them more water-resistant. They were not comfortable. They were heavy, stiff, and they smelled powerfully of whatever animal had donated its skin to the project. But they were extraordinarily effective at keeping out the cold and the wet. And on the open deck of a longship in the North Atlantic at night, keeping out the cold and the wet was the entire challenge. You dragged yours out from under your sea chest, where it had been rolled and stored during the day. It was stiff from the cold and the salt, and unrolling it required effort. The hide was perhaps 2 centimeters thick in places, heavy enough that simply lifting the rolled bundle required both arms. But once you had climbed inside and pulled the top closed around you, the effect was immediate and remarkable. Your own body heat, trapped within the insulating layers of the hide, began to accumulate. Within minutes, the interior of the sack had risen from the ambient air temperature of perhaps 4 or 5 degrees Celsius to something approaching body warmth. You were not comfortable. You were lying on a wet wooden deck inside a stiff animal skin sack, and every movement required negotiating with several kilograms of unyielding leather. But you were warm, and on a voyage of weeks across the North Atlantic, warm was everything. A curious note from the sagas. Several references describe sailors emerging from their sleeping sacks in the morning with the sack having frozen solid on the outside overnight. The dew and spray that had condensed on the exterior had turned to ice. But inside, the man was warm. The hud fat had worked exactly as intended. The moisture inside his own breath and body heat had nowhere to go except outward through the layers of hide and in freezing temperatures. This created a kind of natural insulation as the outer surface crusted over. Scholars still debate exactly how widespread these sleeping sacks were. Some argue that the evidence suggests they were standard equipment for every seaman on a long voyage. Others suggest they may have been personal possessions owned only by those wealthy enough to afford properly tanned hides of this size. The archaeological evidence is fragmentary because leather decays far more readily than wood or metal, and only exceptional preservation conditions would leave us a Viking sleeping sack to study. What we have instead are references in the sagas and the logic of the situation, which together suggest strongly that some form of waterproof sleeping covering was essential survival equipment. You have your sleeping sack. But where exactly on the deck do you sleep? This turns out to be a more complicated question than it might appear, and the answer reveals something important about Viking society at sea. The longship had no formal sleeping quarters, but it did have better and worse positions, and those positions were allocated according to a social hierarchy that was strict even by medieval standards. The stern, the back of the ship where the steersman sat and where the steering oar was mounted, was the domain of the ship's captain, who on a Viking vessel was usually called the steersman or helmsman. This was the most protected position on the ship in one specific sense. It was highest above the waterline. The bow of the ship plunged into waves and threw spray backward across the deck. The stern rose and fell more gently. If you slept in the bow, you woke soaked. If you slept in the stern, you had a marginally better chance of staying dry. The captain therefore slept in the stern. His most trusted companions slept near him. The newest members of the crew, the youngest men on their first voyages, slept in the bow. They got wet the most often, froze the most consistently, and complained the most frequently. The sagas are full of young men lamenting their position at the front of the ship, which experienced sailors listened to with the polite disinterest of people who had already served their time at the bow and felt no particular sympathy. Imagine yourself somewhere in the middle of the ship, which placed you in the middling rank of the crew. Not favored enough for the stern, not junior enough for the bow. You arranged your sea chest against the low side of the hull, angled so that your back was to the wind, and climbed into your sleeping sack with a particular series of contortions that the combination of narrow space and stiff leather required. To your left, a man named Bjorn was already asleep, his snoring barely audible over the sound of the wind and the water. To your right, a young man from somewhere in the east of Norway was still awake, staring up at the stars with an expression of concentrated misery. You closed your eyes. The ship rose and fell. The rigging hummed. The cold pressed against the outside of your sack. And somewhere between all of that, eventually, improbably, you slept. The cold at sea is not the same as the cold on land, and understanding this distinction is essential to understanding what Viking sailors experienced every night on their voyages. On land, even in the harsh Norwegian winter, you can shelter from the wind. You can find a valley, a building, a dense stand of trees that breaks the direct assault of moving air against your body. On a ship in open water, there is no shelter from the wind. It comes from whatever direction it comes from, and it comes without obstruction, and it strips heat from exposed skin with a speed and efficiency that still air cold cannot match. The technical term is wind chill, And while Viking sailors did not have a term for it, they understood it profoundly and experientially. A night that was merely cold in the town was potentially lethal on the open water, because the same air temperature combined with the constant wind that moved the ship produced a felt temperature many degrees colder than any thermometer would record. Against this, the sailors had several strategies beyond the sleeping sack itself. The most basic was clothing. A Viking sailor going to sea wore layers that would strike the modern eye as remarkably sensible. The base layer was wool, worn directly against the skin. This sounds immediately uncomfortable by modern standards, but the wool used for undergarments in this period was often a softer variety than the coarser material used for outer garments. And more importantly, wool retains its insulating properties even when wet, which virtually no other natural fiber does as effectively. When you are sleeping on the deck of a ship that is constantly wetted by spray, the ability of your clothing to keep you warm even when damp is not a minor consideration. It is the difference between surviving the night and not. Over the wool came heavier outer layers, cloaks of thick woven fabric and sometimes animal skins, and over everything, when conditions demanded it, capes or cloaks of leather or treated cloth that shed water. The Viking sailor going to sleep on the open deck was a person who had spent years learning, through painful trial and error, exactly how many layers of exactly what materials were required to survive any given combination of temperature, wind, and precipitation. There is a curious observation buried in several saga accounts. Men sometimes slept fully clothed in their sea gear, their cloaks and outer layers left on even in the sleeping sack, creating a double cocoon of warmth. The discomfort of sleeping in your outdoor clothing, which would strike any modern person as unbearable, was simply accepted as the price of surviving the night. But clothing and sleeping sacks were only part of the picture. The other major variable in the comfort and survival of a Viking night at sea was the sail. The longship's sail, when furled and no longer needed for propulsion, became an extremely valuable piece of equipment for an entirely different purpose. A ship's sail in this period was a large rectangular piece of woven wool, often reinforced with leather strips in a diamond or grid pattern, and it could measure up to 80 square meters for a large vessel. When the wind died, or when the crew needed to row, the sail was taken down and bundled along the center of the ship. And at night, it became a communal blanket. Men would crawl under the folded sail together, 10 or 15 or 20 of them pressed close against one another, the enormous weight of the wool above them acting as both insulation and windbreak, their combined body heat building within the space beneath it into something approaching tolerable warmth. This arrangement was crowded, smelly, and involved a degree of physical proximity with your shipmates that would feel deeply uncomfortable to modern sensibilities. But it worked. The combination of close bodies and heavy wool sail above could raise the temperature under the sail by several degrees compared to the open deck. And on a cold night, several degrees was the difference between waking up functional and waking up dangerously chilled. Scholars who have reconstructed Viking voyages using authentic materials and period-appropriate techniques have confirmed this. The sail as collective blanket arrangement was not merely a romantic notion from the sagas. It was a practical heating strategy that made extended voyages at the latitudes the Vikings frequented not merely possible but sustainable. A curious detail from one reconstruction voyage in the 20th century. The crew of a replica Viking ship, sailing authentic routes with authentic equipment, reported that the nights under the sail were among the more comfortable parts of the experience, warmer and better protected than they had expected. The discomfort was the proximity, the unavoidable intimacy of 24 people pressed together in a wool tent on a moving deck. But the warmth was real. Imagine yourself now in that arrangement. You are lying on the deck, your sea chest under your head as a pillow, your sleeping sack pulled up around you, and above and around you the heavy folds of the sail are draped over the central part of the ship, creating a low roof of wool through which the wind cannot easily penetrate. To your left, someone's knee is in your ribs. To your right, someone's elbow is in your back. The smell is considerable, a mixture of unwashed men, wet wool, salt water, and the oil used to preserve the leather of the sleeping sacks. But the air is warming. Your body is no longer fighting a losing battle against the cold. You are approaching something that might, generously, be called rest. Sleep itself on the open ocean was a different experience from sleep on land, and understanding this requires a small digression into the physiology of what the sea does to a sleeping human body. The motion of a ship at sea is constant and varied. Waves come from different directions. The ship pitches forward and back, rolls from side to side, and occasionally does both simultaneously in a corkscrew motion that quickly identifies anyone susceptible to seasickness. This constant motion, which experienced sailors cease to consciously notice, does not cease to affect the body when that person falls asleep. The inner ear continues to register every movement. The muscles of the body continue to make small, constant adjustments to maintain balance even in sleep. The result is that sleep at sea is, for most people, significantly lighter than sleep on land, more frequently interrupted by the sudden lurch of a wave, more prone to the kind of half-conscious hovering state that is neither proper sleep nor full wakefulness. For Viking sailors who spent weeks or months at sea, this pattern of fragmented, motion-interrupted sleep was simply normal. Their bodies adapted to it in ways that landlocked people's bodies do not. Experienced seafarers develop the ability to fall asleep quickly and to return to sleep quickly after interruption, skills that took years of voyaging to acquire, and that represented a form of physical expertise as real as the ability to read wind and current. A new sailor on his first voyage would spend the first several nights barely sleeping at all, lying awake in the unfamiliar motion, his body unable to distinguish the normal movement of the ship from the beginning of danger. Every large wave would jolt him awake. Every sound of the rigging would pull him from the edge of sleep. He would arrive in the morning gray-faced and hollow-eyed, barely capable of rowing, and the older sailors would watch him with the patient contempt of people who had gone through exactly the same process and had no particular interest in shortening it for the next generation. By the second or third week, if he survived, the adaptation would have begun. His body would have learned the rhythm of the sea. He would sleep through the waves that had previously woken him, his unconscious mind now able to distinguish between the normal and the alarming in the language of the ship's motion. This was not simply habituation. It was a recalibration of the nervous system, a genuine physiological change, and it was one of the things that separated an experienced Viking sailor from a novice as clearly as any skill with weapons or navigation. Not everyone on a Viking ship slept at the same time. This seems obvious in retrospect, but it is worth exploring in some detail because the management of night watches was one of the more sophisticated social technologies of Viking seafaring, and it directly shaped the sleep patterns of everyone aboard. A ship at sea cannot be left unattended at night. Someone must watch the sky for changes in weather. Someone must monitor the steering oar and ensure the ship remains on course. Someone must watch for other vessels, for rocks and shallows in unfamiliar waters, for all the invisible hazards that the dark sea conceals. On a longship, this duty fell to the crew on a rotating basis, and the management of these watches, who stood them, for how long, in what rotation, was a matter of both practical necessity and social negotiation. The standard arrangement appears to have been watches of roughly 2 to 3 hours, with the crew divided into watch groups that rotated through the night. This meant that on any given night, a sailor might expect to stand 1 or sometimes 2 watches, separated by periods of sleep, creating the segmented sleep pattern that scholars of medieval life have identified across multiple cultures in this period. The man on watch stood at the stern with the steering oar, his eyes adjusted to the darkness, his body wrapped in everything he owned, counting the stars and the waves and the time until his relief appeared. The cold was worse standing still than lying down. Without the insulation of the sleeping sack and the shelter of the sail, the wind found every gap in his clothing and made his eyes water and his fingers ache. Men on watch developed their own strategies for endurance. They moved constantly, walking the short length of deck available to them, swinging their arms, stamping their feet on the wooden planks to keep circulation moving. They told themselves stories in their heads to stay awake. They watched the stars with the focused attention of navigators, tracking the movement of the sky and computing from it the ship's position and course. When your watch ended and your relief appeared, the transition from the cold, alert wakefulness of the watch to the warmth of the sleeping sack felt like falling into another world. You crawled back under the sail, negotiated your way into the space your absence had allowed the neighboring sleepers to fill, and pulled your sack around you. The residual cold on your skin made the warmth seem extraordinary. Within minutes, exhaustion and the relief of shelter pulled you under. Food and drink played a role in nighttime survival at sea that is easy to underestimate. The caloric demands of a day of rowing in cold conditions were enormous, and the Vikings understood, in practical if not theoretical terms, that what you ate in the evening determined to a significant extent how well you survived the night. The standard diet on a Viking longship was nutritionally dense and deliberately unglamorous. Dried fish, hard bread made from grain that had been dried and compressed into dense cakes, dried meat preserved with salt, and dried fruit when available. These foods were chosen specifically because they did not require cooking, which on an open-deck ship with no fixed hearth was a significant logistical challenge, and because they were calorie-dense in relation to their weight. But when conditions allowed, and weather permitted a small fire in an iron brazier on the deck, something warmer was prepared. Porridge made from grain, stewed dried meat in water, or occasionally fresh fish taken from the sea and cooked over the coals. These hot meals were moments of genuine comfort in an otherwise relentlessly uncomfortable existence, and the sagas treat them with a respect that suggests their importance was understood. To eat something hot before sleeping was to give your body the fuel it needed to maintain its core temperature through the cold hours of darkness. Water was a constant challenge. Fresh water taken aboard in barrels at the start of a voyage was carefully rationed, because refilling was possible only when land was near. Ale was sometimes carried, but in limited quantities. The daily drink ration on a Viking voyage was probably smaller than most modern people would find comfortable, and the combination of physical exertion and limited fluid intake left sailors in a state of mild chronic dehydration that affected both their waking performance and their sleep. A curious note from the sagas. Several references describe men chewing on strips of dried fish or hard bread before sleeping, partly for the calories but also, it seems, as a form of comfort, a ritual that marked the transition from the active work of the day to the passive endurance of the night. There is something recognizable in this, something that connects the Viking sailor chewing his dried fish to every modern person who reaches for a snack before bed. The question of hygiene on a Viking voyage is one that polite accounts of these expeditions tend to skip past quickly, but it is directly relevant to the experience of sleeping on the open deck because it shaped the sensory environment in ways that modern people would find challenging. On a long voyage of several weeks, there was no bathing. There was no washing of clothing. There was no changing into clean garments for sleeping. The men on the ship smelled, collectively and individually, of everything they had done and eaten and experienced since they last had access to fresh water and soap, which might be weeks in the past. The sleeping arrangements, with their compressed intimacy under the collective sail or in adjacent sleeping sacks, concentrated these smells into a confined space that an outside observer would have found remarkable. The Vikings themselves appear to have been, by the standards of their contemporaries, unusually attentive to personal hygiene when on land. Archaeological evidence from Viking-age settlements shows combs, tweezers, ear spoons, and other grooming implements in considerable quantity. The popular image of the unwashed savage is not supported by the evidence from domestic contexts. But at sea, the practicalities of freshwater conservation and the absence of any facilities made the Vikings' normal standards of cleanliness entirely impossible to maintain. What this meant for sleeping was a sleeping environment that smelled powerfully of salt water, wet wool, unwashed human bodies, and the various food products that had been consumed and in some cases spilled across the deck during the preceding days. The smell of a Viking longship after 2 weeks at sea was something that required adjustment, and men who had never sailed before invariably found their first voyages severely tested by it before their noses adapted. The adaptation was real. The human olfactory system is remarkably capable of filtering out constant background smells, and after a few days, the smell of the ship became simply the smell of the world, unremarkable and unnoticed. This is a quirky but genuine aspect of the Viking sailor's experience of his sleeping environment. By the end of a long voyage, the smell that had initially been so striking had become invisible. The sleeping space that had seemed impossibly uncomfortable in the first days had become, if not exactly home, at least familiar. One of the more underappreciated aspects of Viking life at sea was the role of music and storytelling in the hours before sleep. The sagas, which are our richest source of information about Viking culture, are themselves the literary descendants of an oral tradition that was practiced every evening on the deck of ships like the one you are imagining yourself on right now. As the day's work ended and the crew settled into the arrangements of the night, a period of social time occurred that was as important to morale and mental health as the physical preparations for sleep. Men sat together on their chests, wrapped in cloaks, and talked. They told stories of past voyages and distant places. They recited poetry in the alliterative verse forms that Viking culture had developed to a high art. They played simple instruments, lyres and simple pipes, whose music carried across the water and mixed with the sound of the sea. This was not merely entertainment. It was the mechanism by which Viking culture transmitted itself across generations at sea. The stories told on the deck of the longship were the histories and myths and practical knowledge of the Norse world, passed from older men to younger ones in the most literal possible sense. A young man on his first voyage learned from the stories told before sleep. Everything from the navigational knowledge of unfamiliar waters to the social and religious values of his culture. And the poetry served a specific psychological function in the context of sleep preparation. The rhythmic, highly patterned verse of Viking skaldic poetry has a regularity and repetition that is, in modern terms, genuinely relaxing. The elaborate alliterative structures and the recurring patterns of stressed and unstressed syllables create a kind of verbal music that, listened to in darkness with the sound of the sea underneath it, is conducive to the drowsy, receptive state that precedes sleep. Scholars who have studied the tradition have noted that the performance context of this poetry, evenings, semi-darkness, a gathered audience in a relaxed state, is consistent with a function that included, among other things, helping people fall asleep. A curious detail: some of the longer Viking narrative poems, the ones that told extended stories of heroes and gods and battles, lasted for hours when performed in full. A skilled poet, a skald, could keep an audience in that particular state of drowsy engagement for an entire evening, the story itself providing just enough stimulation to keep the mind pleasantly occupied while the body gradually succumbed to exhaustion. This is, in essence, what this video is doing right now. The tradition is older than you might think. Navigation at night on the open ocean is a subject that Viking seafarers understood with an intimacy that modern sailors, with their electronic instruments and satellite positioning, can barely imagine. And it is directly relevant to sleep because the man on watch was also always a navigator, and his ability to read the night sky was one of the most important skills the ship possessed. Viking navigational techniques relied on direct observation of astronomical phenomena. The North Star, visible on clear nights as the fixed point around which all other stars appear to rotate, gave the sailors their latitude. The angle at which the sun rose and set told them about their position relative to east and west. The behavior of birds, the color of the water, the presence or absence of certain cloud formations, all contributed to a comprehensive navigational picture that experienced sailors could maintain even in conditions of limited visibility. But the centerpiece of this system was the stars, and the stars were visible only at night, which meant that the watchman on a clear night was performing a navigation calculation while simultaneously keeping the ship on course and watching for hazards. This required a particular kind of wide attention, the ability to monitor the sky and the water and the ship's behavior simultaneously, while staying alert for any change in any of them. It was exhausting work, and the value of a man capable of doing it well was enormous. Here is a curious thing. The specific combination of skills required for night navigation, the ability to maintain a clear mental model of the ship's position in relation to unseen stars, the patience for long periods of alert waiting, the sensitivity to small changes in the ship's behavior, is also, in the language of modern psychology, a recipe for the kind of focused, low-stimulus mindfulness that is associated with states adjacent to sleep. Men who had stood many night watches developed a particular quality of awareness, calm and alert simultaneously, that was almost meditative in character. Scholars who have studied Viking navigation still debate the full range of instruments and techniques available to Norse sailors. Some argue for the existence of a sunstone, a crystal that could detect the position of the sun on overcast days through the polarization of light, a device referenced in some later Norse sources. Others are skeptical, arguing that the evidence is insufficient. What is not disputed is the sophistication of the observational skills that Norse navigators developed through experience, and the degree to which those skills shaped every hour of life on the ship, including the hours of sleep. Not all Viking voyages were long-haul ocean crossings. A significant portion of Norse seafaring was coastal, moving along the shorelines of Norway, around the islands of Scotland and Ireland, along the rivers of England and France. And coastal sailing created different conditions for sleeping that are worth distinguishing from the open ocean experience. On a coastal voyage, the ship could come ashore at night. This was not always done, particularly when speed was the priority, or when the crew was in enemy territory and landing safely was uncertain. But when conditions allowed, beaching the ship for the night gave the crew access to something they lacked at sea entirely: solid ground. The practice of camping ashore from a longship followed patterns that archaeological evidence and saga accounts allow us to reconstruct with reasonable confidence. The ship was run onto a beach or into a river estuary, its mast lowered and secured, and a camp was established on the shore. Tents might be erected using the ship's sail as a roof, supported on oars or poles cut from nearby trees. Fires were built, which meant hot food and something approaching genuine warmth for the first time in days or weeks. The sleeping arrangements on shore were, compared to the open deck of the ship, almost luxurious. A curious note from several saga accounts. Men who had been sleeping at sea for extended periods sometimes found it difficult to sleep on shore in the first nights after landing. The ground was too still. The absence of the ship's constant motion, which their bodies had adapted to completely, created a sensation of wrongness that kept them awake. One account describes a man who could not sleep in a feather bed after a long voyage because the silence and stillness were more disturbing to him than the wind and the waves had ever been. His companions found this highly amusing. Scholars call this phenomenon mal de débarquement, or land sickness, and while it is typically associated with modern sailors, there is no reason to think it was any less real for Viking seafarers. The body's adaptation to the motion of the sea was so complete that its absence registered as an abnormality requiring adjustment. Sleep, like all the other bodily functions, had been recalibrated to account for the sea, and the sea's sudden absence was itself a disruption. The relationship between the Vikings and death was not the morbid fascination that popular accounts sometimes suggest, but a practical acknowledgement of the conditions under which they lived and worked. Men died at sea. Not rarely, not in exceptional circumstances, but regularly, as a normal occupational hazard of a life spent on the water. Sleeping at sea therefore carried a psychological dimension that is difficult to fully appreciate from the perspective of a culture in which death in bed is the norm. For the Viking sailor, closing his eyes on the deck of the longship was an act of trust in the ship and the crew, and the weather, and his own physical resilience, against the background knowledge that none of these things were fully reliable. The man who fell asleep on watch could send the ship onto rocks. The man who slept too heavily in deteriorating weather might not wake in time to respond to an emergency. The man who became too cold in the night might not wake at all. This awareness of mortality did not paralyze these people. It informed the way they slept, the rituals of preparation they performed, the level of alertness they maintained even in sleep. A Viking sailor slept in what we might call an armed state, ready to come awake fully and immediately at the sound of the watch's alarm or the wrong motion of the ship. The transition from sleep to full alert readiness was, for experienced seamen, a matter of seconds. One of the more poignant observations in the saga literature is the frequency with which men describe the sea at night in terms of beauty. The same water that could kill them was also, on clear nights with the northern lights moving across the sky and the stars reflected in the dark water below. Extraordinary. Men who watched night after night from the stern of a longship developed a relationship with the night sky that was simultaneously navigational and aesthetic. They knew the stars as practical information. They also found them beautiful. Imagine now lying in your sleeping sack on the deck, your watch ended, the next man taking the stern. Above you, the sky is clear, and the stars are so bright and numerous that the darkness between them seems to pulse with light. The ship rises gently on a long swell and falls back, rises and falls. The rigging murmurs. The water speaks in its ancient language against the hull. You are cold. You are tired. You are a long way from anywhere that could be called home, on a vessel that is surrounded in every direction by an ocean that does not know your name. And yet somehow, in the accumulation of all these difficult things, there is something else. A kind of peace that comes specifically from being exactly where you are, with no other options, in the middle of the only world available. The simplicity of the situation is itself a form of comfort. You cannot worry about what you left behind or what waits ahead. There is only this: the stars, the sea, the motion of the ship, the sound of sleeping men around you. Your eyes close. The stars continue their slow rotation. The ship carries you onward through the dark. Morning on a Viking longship came with the first gray light in the east, and the transition from the sleeping ship to the working ship was as choreographed and practiced as everything else about life at sea. Men emerged from sleeping sacks and from under the sail with the deliberate efficiency of people who had repeated this sequence hundreds of times, each step performed in the correct order, nothing wasted. The first priority was always the ship. The night watch delivered his report, the overnight conditions, any vessels seen, any change in weather or sea state. The condition of the rigging was checked. The bilge was sounded. The wooden ship leaked constantly in small quantities, and water accumulation overnight required pumping or bailing before the day's work could begin. The sails were inspected for any damage from the night's wind. Then, and only then, came the small comforts of morning. The redistribution of the clothing that had served as extra insulation in the night. The consumption of the morning meal, typically the same dried fish and bread that had been eaten the previous evening, occasionally supplemented by fresh water. The slow warming of bodies that had spent the night in the cold, the stretching of stiff joints, the gradual return of full function to hands numbed by the night air. There is a detail here that researchers who have made reconstruction voyages on replica longships consistently mention: the hours immediately after dawn, when the cold of the night is still in the bones but the sky is lightening and the ship is waking around you, have a particular quality. The hardship of the night behind you, the day ahead not yet demanding anything, the light improving, the temperature beginning to rise. These are, paradoxically, among the most peaceful moments of the voyage. Men who have endured the night together share something in those early morning hours, a quiet solidarity that is not adequately captured by any modern equivalent. The ship that carries them forward is unchanged, the same vessel of the previous night, but the people on it are different in the small way that surviving something difficult always changes people. They have come through another night at sea. They are, in the specific Viking sense of the word, still alive. And in that, there is a kind of triumph. Let the longship begin to fade now. Let the sound of the waves grow softer, and let the smell of salt water and pine resin drift away on the wind. The ship is still out there, somewhere in the dark water, but it is growing distant, becoming a story rather than an experience. You are back in your own bed, in your own room, and the contrast is worth sitting with for a moment. The surface beneath you does not move. The temperature is regulated, not by the stiff hide of a sleeping sack, but by systems so efficient and invisible that you never need to think about them. There is no wind. There are no waves. There is no colleague's elbow in your back, no smell of wet wool, no question of whether the night watch will wake you in time if the weather turns. The Vikings who sailed these ships were not made of different material than you are. They were the same species, with the same bodies, the same need for sleep, the same discomfort in cold and wet conditions. What they had that allowed them to endure was not some superhuman toughness, but a set of practical adaptations. The sleeping sack, the sail, the shared warmth, the learned indifference to the ship's motion that transformed the seemingly impossible into the merely difficult. Every generation inherits the knowledge of the previous one, refined and improved, the accumulated solutions to problems that someone, somewhere, once faced for the first time without any guidance. The first Viking sailor who pulled an animal hide around himself on a cold night at sea was solving a problem through improvisation. The 100th generation of Viking sailors who reached for the hud fat as a matter of course was inheriting a solution so well established it required no thought. This is, in a very real sense, what all of human history is. The slow accumulation of solutions. The passing of hard-won knowledge from one generation to the next, in the hope that the next generation will find things a little easier than the last. The stars outside your window are the same stars the Viking navigators used to find their way home. The ocean is still out there, still moving as it has always moved, still as indifferent and extraordinary as it was when the first longship ventured out onto its surface. But you are warm. You are still. You are home. Let your breathing slow now. Let the sound of the sea, which you can almost hear if you listen, become the sound of your own rest. The longship is somewhere far away, on a dark ocean under a sky full of stars. The men on it are wrapped in their sleeping sacks, dreaming of land, of fires, of hot food and dry ground, and the faces of people they love. Sleep as they slept, knowing that the night, however long and cold, is also temporary. Knowing that somewhere on the other side of the dark there is always a morning. Good night. Safe crossing. Sweet dreams.